The winter of 1940 lay over northern Europe like a sheet of cold gray iron pressed hard against the sky. The air held a sharp mix of haze, salt frost, and the lingering smell of smoke that never seemed to fade. Every morning on the continent felt as if it awakened inside a wave of bitter cold sweeping down from the north. Not long before, the Battle of Britain had finally subsided, yet neither side had truly recovered from the months of violent struggle that had torn the skies apart. The Royal Air Force, still wounded and thinly stretched, continued its reconnaissance flights with battered units. The German Luftwaffe, bruised and unsettled, stumbled through the painful process of adjusting its strategy after the defeat. In the dim and icy morning light, the doors of the hangars belonging to the German 3rd Fighter Wing creaked open. Engine steam turned white the instant it touched the winter air, and the ground crew called out to one another through scarves and ice-stiffened gloves, shouting warnings about oil temperature and brittle fuel lines. Each engine sounded like a restless animal forced awake too early in the dead of winter, breathing unevenly, threatening to choke. Hans Kühler stood beside the runway, tightening his leather gloves with hands red from the cold. At 24, he had already endured 4 months of the Battle of Britain, surviving through nights of exhaustion and days filled with smoke and fear. When the war began, he had been a young man full of dreams about flight. Now he felt that his life was trapped inside an endless night raid, from which he could never escape. He no longer remembered how many times he had taken off in winter. He remembered only how many comrades had vanished into those cold, early morning clouds and never returned. There were no crash sites for them, only a single hard line in the daily report: did not return. A sergeant rushed out of the hangar and pushed a damp, crumpled mission sheet into his hand. It carried only one sentence: radar detected a reconnaissance aircraft over the North Sea. Immediate takeoff. No model of the enemy aircraft. No numbers. No analysis of weather. Early war air combat often began this way: rough, rushed, and deadly. Hans took a breath that chilled his lungs and climbed onto the wing of his fighter. He knew that once he lifted off, he would be gambling with his life in air so cold it could turn a minor malfunction into a fatal plunge. Any sudden vibration, any frost forming on the fuselage, could transform the aircraft into a falling piece of frozen steel. While his engine shuddered awake, another aircraft was crossing the same sky miles away. It was a British reconnaissance plane flown by Robert Davies of the Royal Air Force. After completing his training assignment following the Battle of Britain, this mission was one of his first real operations. His task was to photograph shipyards and coastal batteries along northern Germany, crucial information and equally dangerous to obtain. Robert was only 21, having come straight from a classroom into the war. His reconnaissance plane carried little protection and only enough speed to make escape possible if conditions were perfect. His flight instructor had told him, "Do not fight German fighters. If you see one, run." But the clouds over the North Sea were enemies of their own. They formed moving walls that confused radar, distorted distance, and turned every maneuver into a guess. As Robert emerged from the thick cloud cover, sunlight stabbed into his eyes, forcing him to squint. He saw only the faint outline of coastline rising below him. Behind him, the radar warning light blinked so rapidly, it looked ready to burn out. He did not know that German radar had spotted him as well. He certainly did not know that Hans's fighter was already diving toward him. The base commander's voice crackled urgently through German radio channels. Anti-aircraft batteries were tracking the airspace, and the wind over the North Sea sliced along aircraft skins like a blade. Before Robert could adjust to the sudden glare above the clouds, the trembling in his aircraft intensified sharply. It felt as though someone had struck the underside of his wing with a hammer. The alarm began its harsh, broken screech, a cold mechanical wail that filled the cockpit. He still had not seen the enemy fighter. Robert shoved the control stick right, and the fragile reconnaissance plane slid sideways like a scrap of tin caught in the wind. He knew that the instant his position was exposed, the chase had begun. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Hans burst from a gap in the cloud bank. In that single moment, he saw a solitary silhouette far ahead. No escort, no wingman, just one aircraft flying alone. His headset crackled with the voice of his squadron leader shouting, "Maintain altitude. Do not break off alone. The clouds are too thick." But Hans had no time to answer. The target was already drifting out of his firing path. If he did not act now, the clouds would swallow the enemy plane again. He pushed the throttle and the engine screamed. The fighter trembled violently in the cold, as though its own metal lungs were struggling to breathe. The sky above the North Sea tore open in a flash of movement. Hans's first burst of fire grazed the tail of the reconnaissance plane. Sparks burst across the rear edge of the aircraft, and shards of metal glittered in the sunlight as they spun away. Slicing through the air, Robert's head struck the gun sight in front of him as the aircraft jolted, cold fog spread across the glass, and the temperature inside the cockpit fell sharply. Half of his instruments were shaking violently. The aircraft bucked like a wounded bird caught in a storm. Hans's second burst struck the oxygen system. A white spray hissed into the cabin as cold air tore through the fuselage. Robert felt the breath leave his body. He had to bail out. He tried to lift his arm, but felt a numb heaviness spreading rapidly. The mix of cold and lack of oxygen dulled his body and slowed his thoughts. The simple movement of opening the canopy became a test of will instead of training. When he finally forced it open, a violent blast of winter air tore him outward. His ears filled with a sharp pain from the sudden pressure. It felt less like he jumped and more like the sky itself had reached in and snatched him out of the cockpit. The world spun. Below him, his aircraft spiraled downward like a smoking top and vanished into the dark edge of the forest. A slow column of black smoke rose where it disappeared. Robert no longer had the strength to watch. When he struck the wet ground, a deep humming filled his ears, drowning out every sound, even his own breathing. Cold mud splashed across his face, thick with the smell of earth. He tried to stand, but fell to his knees again, trembling uncontrollably. The silence around him was heavy, broken only by a faint barking of dogs somewhere in the distance. Then a painful realization struck him. He had fallen inside Germany. He knew immediately what that meant. Every militia patrol, every armed villager, every angry farmer would see him not as a prisoner of war, but as an intruder who needed to be dealt with quickly. Robert pressed his hand against a tree trunk for support, but a sharp breath escaped him as the cold wind touched the wounded area along his side. He bit down hard to keep quiet. Out here, even the smallest sound could bring a search party straight to him. In the distance, the barking of German dogs became clearer, carried easily through the thin winter air. He needed to hide, but the land around him offered almost nothing, only frozen mud, low shrubs, and the thinning winter trees. His entire body trembled from the cold, turning his skin a deep shade of grayish purple. It felt as if the North Sea wind was slowly sanding the last bit of warmth from him. As he lifted his head, he saw a dark shape circling above the treetops. A fighter plane dipped its wings slightly as it banked. Robert flattened himself against the frozen earth, hardly daring to breathe. He assumed the pilot had already identified him and was now signaling ground patrols. He braced himself for what would follow, imagining rough hands, angry shouts, and perhaps worse. But he did not know what was happening inside the cockpit above him. Hans had seen the parachute fall into the forest. He knew the man who came down was alive. He also knew that returning to help an enemy pilot would be considered an act of betrayal by his own unit. Radio channels around him were filled with shouting, calling his name, ordering him back into formation. But his hand remained on the throttle. Somewhere beneath him, a young man was bleeding into the cold ground. If he did nothing, that life would slip quietly into the winter soil. With a sudden movement, Hans pulled his aircraft away from the patrol route. The engine roared as he turned sharply toward the forest where the parachute had fallen. The moment Hans stepped out of his forced landing site, he did not look back at the damaged machine resting at the edge of the empty field. To him, it was no longer an aircraft, but evidence, something that could expose every decision he was about to make. The wind from the North Sea cut through the folds of his flight suit, carrying the smell of distant salt and the heavy dampness of winter soil. His boots pressed into the frozen earth as he entered the tree line. The bark of dogs drifted through the air again, closer now. Hans quickened his pace. He followed the faint signs on the ground, looking for the place where he had seen the fragile white shape disappear beneath the branches. When he finally found Robert, the forest seemed to fall silent around them. Robert lay curled beside the roots of a fallen pine, the parachute hanging like a torn flag from the branches overhead. The fabric swayed gently in the cold air. His flight suit had been ripped open along one side, and the shirt underneath had frozen stiff against his skin. Blood seeped slowly from the wound near his ribs, forming a dark line that the winter wind had already begun to chill into a purplish stain. His face was pale, his lips blue, his eyes half open but unfocused. He looked suspended between consciousness and darkness, held in place only by some fading instinct to survive. The only sounds in the clearing were the faint rustling of branches and the shallow, uneven breaths from the wounded man. Hans paused a few steps away, watching carefully to see whether Robert could still move. Robert's vision was blurred, but he could make out the shape of a man in a German uniform. The moment he noticed the eagle insignia on the shoulder, his muscles tightened with a weak, instinctive resistance. Yet he had no strength left to fight. Hans took a slow breath and shrugged off his heavy leather jacket. He stepped forward and draped it carefully over Robert's cold body. For a brief second, the forest felt warmer, as if a spark of fire had opened inside the winter air. A sharp whistle sounded in the distance. The barking of the dogs grew louder and more certain. The patrol had reached the edge of the woods. Hans knew he had minutes at best. He lifted Robert as gently as he could, shifting him toward the shelter of a larger tree. He scraped a small hollow in the soft soil near the roots, stuffed the parachute inside, and covered it with branches and fallen leaves. Robert let out a faint cry of pain, little more than a breath, but Hans froze instantly to listen. The searchers had not changed direction. He worked faster. He positioned Robert low behind the trunk, trying to make his outline small, pressed into the shadows. Then Hans stepped away from him and moved deliberately toward the sound of approaching men. He had no weapon, no prepared explanation. All he had was the thin hope that his appearance alone would shift suspicion away from where Robert lay hidden. On purpose, he stepped on several dry branches, letting them snap loudly under his boot. When the patrol finally reached him, they found a German pilot examining the ground with the dissatisfied expression of a man who hated being sent into the forest in winter. The officer in charge lifted a lantern and swept the beam across Hans's face. Hans straightened his posture and answered the questions with calm, clipped certainty, pointing them toward a clearing farther north. His tone held the impatient sharpness of an officer who believed he was wasting his time. It worked. The patrol adjusted their direction and marched away through the trees. Hans waited until their footsteps faded. Then he hurried back to where Robert lay hidden. Robert's awareness was fading again, but faint traces of clarity remained in his eyes. It was the dim light of someone who had not yet given up entirely. Hans slipped Robert's arm over his own shoulder and lifted him slowly. Robert's legs hung weakly beneath him, and the cold earth left deep marks where his boots dragged. Every step Hans took felt like moving through a silent field of danger. They reached an old farmhouse near the edge of the woods. Hans knocked softly, barely more than a touch against the worn door. After a moment, the door opened, and an elderly priest, his hair white as frost, stood in the doorway. His eyes lingered on the wounded young man leaning heavily on Hans, but instead of alarm, a quiet understanding crossed his face. He stepped aside and let them enter without a word. Inside, the warmth from the small stove filled the air, mixed with the smell of damp timber and dust. Robert was placed on a wooden bench close to the fire. The moment the heat touched him, his body shook violently as if fighting its way back from the edge of freezing. His wound began bleeding again under the sudden warmth. The old priest set to work immediately, cleaning the injury with steady hands. Hans stood to the side, his breath still uneven. He watched the young man he had pulled out of the winter mud, now struggling for life in the dim firelight. He felt neither regret nor doubt. The priest gathered the blood-stained cloths and moved quietly around the room. Hans remained in the shadow near the window, unwilling to step too far into the light. He had never been afraid of diving into combat or of facing enemy fire, yet now he felt a weight pressing against his chest, tight and unfamiliar. He had no answer for the decision he had already made. He only knew he could not have done differently. As the fire in the stove settled into a deep red glow, time began to feel heavy, as if something unseen was slowly counting down. The priest walked to the doorway and turned back to look at Hans. For a moment Hans did not move, then he gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement of the burden they were sharing. A soft, tired sound escaped Robert's lips. It was the kind of sound made by someone drifting painfully back from unconsciousness. His eyes opened just a fraction. He saw the wooden beams above him, the dim firelight flickering across the room, and then he saw Hans standing not far away. He had no strength to show surprise or fear. Instead, there was a brief moment of confusion, followed by a fragile understanding. Hans stepped forward and pulled the blanket closer around him so the warmth would reach his body more quickly. He expected nothing in return. He did not hope for gratitude. He acted simply because one pilot had found another lying helpless in the cold, and he could not leave him there to die. The night passed slowly. The faint color of dawn finally crept through the cracks in the shutters, turning the dim air of the farmhouse into a gentle gray. The shape of the furniture softened as morning light touched it. Robert's breathing had grown steadier. The cold sweat on his forehead had dried, and a faint trace of color was beginning to return to his cheeks. Hans stood near the door with his back against the wall. He had not slept. Mud and engine oil still darkened his uniform, marks that looked sharper and more accusing in the pale morning light. Outside, the distant sound of roosters echoed through the small village. It was an ordinary sound in an ordinary morning, yet it carried a warning. With daylight came patrols, searches, and questions. If he stayed too long, the priest would face the same danger as he did. Hans moved toward Robert and placed a small metal water flask beside his hand. Robert stirred slightly, sensing someone nearby. He tried to lift his head, but managed only a small movement. Their eyes met again in the soft morning shadows. The look they exchanged said nothing that needed words. It was simply a quiet recognition, a way of affirming that both of them were still alive, that the night had not been a dream, and that neither of them was alone in this moment. Hans picked up an old folded map from the table and studied the lines once more. He traced the route with his thumb. There would be checkpoints along the way, and villagers who would ask questions. He could not guarantee safety, but he could guarantee one thing. As long as he stayed beside Robert, the young man would not face the danger alone. With slow, careful movements, Hans lifted Robert from the chair. Robert was still weak. His legs refused to bear his weight, and he leaned heavily against Hans. The weight was not great, yet it carried a truth that neither of them could ignore. It was the weight of choosing to protect someone who had been an enemy only hours before. When they stepped outside, the morning air hit them like a cold tide. It was sharper than the night air, carrying the scent of frost and the faint hint of the distant sea. A thin layer of mist hung over the ground, making the farmhouse and the trees appear softer, blurred at the edges. Their boots pressed into the wet earth as they began to move, each step slow and uncertain. Traveling in such weather was dangerous, but staying behind would be worse. Hans remained alert to every detail of the landscape. He avoided the faint column of smoke rising from a small village and skirted around a dirt road blocked by a military wagon. When they passed a thicket of low trees, a flock of crows rose suddenly from the branches with a harsh cry. Robert flinched at the sound, his body tensing in fear, but Hans only glanced upward briefly and continued forward. His calm steadiness, even in this moment, created a sense of quiet resolve that Robert could feel despite his weakened state. It was not the resolve of a hero, it was something quieter, the determination of a man who had made a choice and intended to carry it through to the end. As they neared the coast, the air changed. A faint, cool saltiness drifted toward them, mixed with the damp smell of kelp and wet sand. The cries of distant gulls reached them through the mist. Hans knelt beside Robert on a patch of ground just beyond the edge of the dunes. He studied Robert's pale face, shaped by cold, exhaustion, and lingering pain. Hans had no words to offer, no promises he could keep. Instead, he took a deep, steady breath and slowly pushed forward the small cloth bag containing the map, easing it into Robert's hands. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything he could give: direction, a chance, and the faint hope that the young man might live long enough to find friendly territory. Robert blinked slowly. The movement was small, but it carried meaning. He understood what Hans was doing. The sound of waves rolled against the rocks, steady and patient, as if absorbing the moment into its endless rhythm. Hans stepped back. He remained facing Robert, taking another step, then another, until the mist swallowed the edges of his figure. Robert lost sight of him long before Hans allowed himself to turn away. Many years later, this story was uncovered again, gently lifted out of the winter wind of that distant year. People often say that war has no heroes and no kindness, that it crushes every gentle thing beneath its weight. But sometimes a person chooses to reach against the orders they are given, against the fear around them, against the cruelty of the moment. Sometimes a man simply decides not to be cruel. Acts like these are rarely written in reports or awarded with medals. They remain instead in the memories of those who survived and in the stories passed down quietly to later generations. They remind us that war may force brutality upon nations, but it can never completely extinguish a person's ability to choose compassion. Many winters passed before anyone spoke of that morning again. The world had changed. Borders had shifted. Entire cities had been rebuilt over the ashes of what once was. People grew older, families formed, and the thunder of war slowly faded into the soft hum of distant memory. Yet certain moments do not disappear. They rest in quiet corners of the mind until life finally offers a place for them to be remembered. Robert eventually made his way back to his squadron. Though he never fully recovered the memory of how he survived those long hours after the crash, his fellow airmen assumed he had been hidden by sympathetic villagers. But he knew in his heart that it had been something far rarer. He carried the memory of a German pilot's leather jacket, the weight of a steady arm supporting him through the forest, and the quiet presence of a man who asked for nothing in return. After the war, he tried more than once to find the farmhouse. The maps had changed, roads had been rebuilt, and modern towns had grown where the old paths once lay. The world had moved on, burying the small traces of the winter he remembered so clearly. Hans lived out his life in much the same way. He returned to a Germany that was broken and humbled, and like many others, he began again from nothing. He seldom spoke about his time in the Luftwaffe. When he did, he spoke only of the friends he lost, not of the missions or the battles. The memory of that morning stayed with him, not as a secret he feared, but as something too private and too human to fit into the harsh language of military stories. In the autumn of his old age, Hans kept a small wooden box on a shelf near his window. Inside it lay a single folded map, worn soft at the creases, and a torn piece of fabric from a parachute that had once hung frozen in a pine tree. He never explained these items to his family, but sometimes he would hold the corner of the cloth between between his fingers and stare quietly at the sky, as if searching for a familiar silhouette in the clouds. It was many years later, long after both men had left the world, that their families finally discovered the connection between them. Robert's daughter found his wartime journal tucked inside an old suitcase. Hans's grandson found the map and the piece of parachute cloth while sorting through his belongings. When the two families eventually exchanged letters, the story came together, like a long-lost photograph slowly coming into focus. It was then they understood what neither man had ever managed to say aloud, that in the coldest winter of a brutal war, two young pilots, enemies by uniform, strangers by birth, had met for a few fragile hours in a forest where neither should have survived, and in that meeting, one chose to save the other. The families would later reflect on how simple the choice seemed when written on paper, yet how enormous it must have felt on that frozen morning. It reminded them that history often remembers nations and battles, but rarely the quiet acts that make us human. In the end, this story was carried forward not by medals or monuments, but by the gentle way it was retold across kitchen tables, in letters, and in soft conversations shared between generations. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, people remain capable of choosing a different path. War may demand loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice, but it cannot erase kindness from the human heart. Somewhere in those quiet winter woods of 1940, a moment of compassion took root in the snow. It lasted only a few hours, yet it grew into a memory strong enough to outlive the men who created it. And for those who heard the story in the years that followed, it became something more than a tale of war. It became an example of how one person's choice, even in a world at war, can leave a warmth that echoes far beyond a single lifetime.